Morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
So it's time now to say good morning to you, Ambassador.
Good morning, Wendy. Pleasure to be here.
Yes, up close and personal once again. That's how we like it. Now, we are looking at the South Africa case that was brought by the International Court of Justice against Israel. And people would assume that these are international matters, so Barbados will not have a say per se on them. But we do hold a position, and we have stated what that position is.
Yes, South Africa has brought a case at the International Court of Justice charging Israel with committing genocide against the people of Gaza. And South Africa has asked the ICJ to rule for, to give some provisional measures that would instruct Israel to cease these military operations that are causing the loss of so many civilian lives in Gaza. Now, we in the Caribbean community, we must have an interest in this, because if there's one people on the face of this earth that should understand something about genocide, it is us. I mean, our whole history is steeped in genocide, and I want to remind the Barbadian people that our history in Barbados begins with genocide in Ichiruganim, because for 100 years before the British first settled here, the Spanish and the Portuguese carried out a genocide in Ichiruganim, Barbados, the native name for Barbados, against the Lokono people, the indigenous people of Barbados, and then, of course, the centuries of slavery. So we should have a position in relation to genocide. So we want to look at, first of all, what South Africa is charging Israel with, and then our Caribbean response.
Well, let's see exactly what they have taken to the court.
Gaza, which is one of the most densely populated places in the world, is home to approximately 2.3 million Palestinians, almost half of them children. For the past 96 days, Israel has subjected Gaza to what has been described as one of the heaviest conventional bombing campaigns in the history of modern warfare. Palestinians in Gaza are being killed by Israeli weaponry and bombs from air, land, and sea. They are also at immediate risk of death by starvation, dehydration, and disease as a result of the ongoing siege by Israel, the destruction of Palestinian towns, the insufficient aid being allowed through to the Palestinian population, and the impossibility of distributing this limited aid while bombs fall. This conduct renders essentials to life unobtainable. At this provisional measures stage, as this court has made clear in the Gambia-Myanmar case, it is not necessary for the court to come to a final view on the question of whether Israel's conduct constitutes genocide. It is necessary to establish only whether at least some of the acts alleged are capable of falling within the provisions of the Convention.
Israel has a genocidal intent against the Palestinians in Gaza. That is evident from the way in which Israel's military attack is being conducted, which has been described by Ms. Hassim SC. It is systematic in its character and form. The mass displacement of the population of Gaza, headed into areas where they continue to be killed, and the deliberate creation of conditions that, quote, lead to a slow death, unquote. There is also the clear pattern of conduct, the targeting of family homes and civilian infrastructure, laying waste to vast areas of Gaza, and the bombing, shelling, and sniping of men, women, and children where they stand, the destruction of the health infrastructure, and lack of access to humanitarian assistance.
We've heard it there firsthand, Ambassador.
Yeah, those were the South African lawyers. The case started last week, Thursday, the 11th, and went on. Then we heard from Israel on the Friday, the 12th. And yes, so the case has been laid out, and the court will rule. The court is not going to rule initially on the merits of the case, but because South Africa has said, look, this is an urgent matter, and we want you, before you even deal with the full merits of the case, we want you to issue some provisional orders to bring a pause, because if not, irreparable damage is going to be done, and the court has to determine whether South Africa has laid out a plausible case for genocide. And if the court is satisfied that, although we haven't ruled on the full merits, but there's a plausible case, South Africa has a plausible case, the court can then say to Israel, we order you to cease fire until there can be a full hearing of this matter.
In terms of the region, how many of our leaders have come forward thus far and said, we decry this?
Well, you know, CARICOM issued a statement, but they issued a statement pretty early on, and the statement was, you know, kind of condemning both sides, the Israelis and Hamas. But as the Israeli assault on Gaza has gone on, and we are now about, I think this is 100 days now, and some 23,000 Palestinians have been killed. Separate CARICOM countries have come out with individual positions. So, for example, our Barbados did issue a statement pretty early on, but then Prime Minister Motley came out with a very strong statement in which she characterized what was happening in Gaza as the world's very first televised genocide. And I think it's important that we hear that, we revisit that statement.
And I think it is important for all of us to revisit it.
Yeah.
Let's hear Prime Minister Mia Moore-Motley.
What is going on in Gaza is a travesty, and it offends every human sensibility. We were offended for sure on October 7th when persons were killed in Israel in acts that were utter terror. But what has happened since then is dwarfing that in terms of the scale of I don't even think the horror and terror is sufficient to describe it. Because separate from the bombs, the notion that people will not have access to water, or people do not have access to fuel, or that babies have to lie on beds cuddled next to one another in the pictures that we've seen in order to keep some level of warmth. These things are not good. It is perhaps the first televised genocide, and hence the world is responding across. I think in our own country this weekend we have a march.
There we have it. Now, did you get to go to that march?
No, I think I might have been out of the country at the time. But that, you know, I think she hit the nail on the head when she spoke about the first televised genocide, and that phrase has resonated with a lot of people. We also had Belize responding. In fact, I really give kudos to the government of Belize, because they took the very decisive step of suspending their diplomatic relations with Israel. So they, rejected Israel's ambassador to Belize, and they recalled their own diplomatic representation in Israel. And they made it very clear. They said, the government of Belize has repeatedly condemned the actions of the Israeli Defense Force in Gaza. We have appealed to Israel to implement an immediate ceasefire and to allow unimpeded access to humanitarian supplies. Despite our requests, Israel has not stopped its violation of international humanitarian law, nor allowed relief workers to alleviate the suffering of millions of Gazans. And it is within that context that they withdrew their accreditation for Israel's ambassador to
And I think
Belize.
that part has a lot of people really, really shook. The fact that so many children are being born today and dying tomorrow. The majority of hospitals have now been shelled, so there's really nowhere for the sick to go, you know, and so many scattered and displaced families. And it does seem to be like we need to wipe them all out. That's how it's coming across to the rest of us.
And you know, the tragedy, Wendy, is that back in 1945, the world set up an international system and international institutions that were supposed to deal with these kinds of situations. So there's an institution called the United Nations Security Council.
Yes.
And the UN Charter says that when an episode like this emerges of breach of the international peace, military conflict, that the UN Security Council is supposed to step forward, step into the situation, take charge of it, and settle it and bring it back to international peace. The United Nations Security Council has not functioned. The US, I mean, it's ironic. The US has vetoed any effort at the UN Security Council to order a ceasefire. And what is ironic is that when the ICJ rules on this matter, the ICJ can only make an order. The ICJ cannot enforce that order. It is expected that the ICJ is really the court of the United Nations. It is established within the UN Charter. And it is expected that it is the UN Security Council that will take action to enforce an ICJ order. However, the United States, two permanent members of the Security Council, the United States and the UK, have actually joined Israel in the suit. In other words, they have come out and they have said, we are supporting Israel in the case before the ICJ. So if perchance the ICJ happens to make an order against Israel, and the Security Council is now charged with the responsibility for enforcing it, you have two permanent members of the Security Council that have already said, hey, we are on the side of Israel. You know? So, you know, last week we were talking about the dysfunction in these international institutions and the fact that developing countries like the CARICOM countries are insisting that these institutions that were set up at a time when all of us were colonies have to be reformed to make them more functional in this 21st century. And this is a glaring example of an international institution, the Security Council, the UN Security Council, that is dysfunctional, you know. And so this whole situation with Gaza is creating a very serious crisis of confidence in the international institutions. I also want to say that St. Vincent and the Grenadines also, to my way of thinking, did us proud, because last week, on the very day that the case began at the ICJ, the St. Vincent government issued a statement, and perhaps I can just quote quickly. The government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines unequivocally supports the initiative of South Africa, and again reiterates the just demand for a ceasefire. International law and elemental humanity ought to prevail over barbarism, genocide, and a wanton abuse of military might. St. Vincent also calls for a cessation of material support and succor for Israel and Gaza provided by some governments. Those who continue to do so are complicit in genocide before our very eyes.
Now, while there's been a shift in terms of who now sits at the table for CARICOM, where the Security Council is concerned. Guyana, I believe, is now in the chair. We haven't heard from them, but they only would have taken up in January. So do you think it's going to be a wait and see before we get a pronouncement on that end?
Well, just for the benefit of our viewers, the Security Council has 15 members. 5 of them are permanent members, and the 5 permanent members are the big powers at the time of the Second World War: the US, UK, France, Russia, and China. They are permanent. Then the other 10 are non-permanent members, and at any time, two of those seats are reserved for Latin America and the Caribbean. Usually they're monopolized by the Latin Americans, but sometimes we have had Caribbean countries being able to compete for and get one of those 2 non-permanent seats. So a couple of years ago it was St. Vincent, and now Guyana has gotten one of those non-permanent seats, and as you said, Guyana started holding that seat in January. But there's only so much that a non-permanent member of the Security Council could do, because the permanent members have the power of veto. So there were efforts in the Security Council to bring a resolution instructing Israel to institute a humanitarian ceasefire, but the United States vetoed it. So the Security Council did eventually pass a resolution, but a very watered down resolution that does not. The critical thing is a humanitarian ceasefire. Now, the UN General Assembly, which is under the presidency of a CARICOM man, Ambassador Dennis Francis of Trinidad and Tobago, he's the current president of the General Assembly. The General Assembly was able to pass a resolution instructing Israel to institute a humanitarian ceasefire. But Israel has flouted the ruling of the General Assembly, and unlike the Security Council, the General Assembly does not have that kind of power to be able to enforce a resolution of the General Assembly.
What's the use of a body without teeth?
Well, the General Assembly is the forum in which all of the nations of the world come together. So when the General Assembly pronounce, it is after all of the countries have deliberated, and a General Assembly pronouncement really represents the considered opinion of the vast
of the world,
international community. Now, it was recognized ironically, by the United States back in the 1950s, that if the Security Council is dysfunctional because a member state continues to veto, that the General Assembly should be able to exercise initiative to at least not just issue a statement, but to put some pressure behind that statement. And the United States is who pushed this back in the 1950s at the time of the Korean War, right? When Russia was using its veto in the Security Council. So, in light of that precedent that was set back in the 1950s, the General Assembly does have some elbow room to do some things, and I would think that having passed a resolution instructing Israel to institute a humanitarian ceasefire, and Israel having flouted that instruction, that the General Assembly should now, reconvene. Exactly.
And bring sanctions. That's what we would hope.
One would think so.
Because there has to be something somewhere in the laws, because everyone doesn't always follow the edict. So therefore, you have additional provisions that if X should go wrong, you back up with Y. We're still waiting on the Y.
Yes, I would hope that the General Assembly would recognize the logic of that. Look, we passed a resolution, it has been disrespected, if we are to be taken seriously, there must be some consequences for disrespecting that resolution. There must be some penalties that we call upon all of our member states to impose, whether those penalties relate to trade and economic relations, or they relate to diplomatic recognition. But one would hope that the General Assembly, because again, it is about us preserving the integrity of the international
institution,
systems and a
yes.
rules-based international order. And if powerful
Where
countries...
there's no order, there's mayhem.
Exactly. If powerful countries can just flout the rulings of international institutions, what are we left with? We're left with the law of the jungle.
But that's what I'm getting to know, because if you're not going to be respecting the international law, it means at some point issues of sovereignty, etc., will be brought into question and undermined. Because if we as a group, and if the sum is supposed to be greater than the part, but the part is deciding I'm not playing a part with the full grouping, something has to give.
Yes, the whole thing falls apart, and then we will be left with, how can we reconstruct out of all of this chaos and disorder? How can we construct for the future something that makes sense? In fact, I think that the next few weeks are going to be really critical, because the eyes of the world are on this situation. The eyes of the world are on that court case.
And let's not forget that they're also weeping as they watch.
Yes, we're all weeping, because what we see wanton destruction of babies, of women, of innocent
that
civilians,
are going
right?
on. You
But
know, there's so many crimes
yes, and
taking
if
place within the war of itself as well.
and if things transpire to suggest to the people of the world that in spite of all that we are seeing, as Prime Minister Motley said, it's not that somebody is telling us these things, we are seeing it on our television screens. If in spite of all of that, the international system proves ineffectual, unable to do anything that makes sense to alleviate it, people will lose confidence. Exactly.
Where's the hope?
Exactly. And therefore, if the ICJ does rule against Israel and says, institute a humanitarian ceasefire, and Israel flouts it, and then the Security Council does nothing again, that will be a tremendous blow to people's confidence in all of these
in the
international
entire system.
institutions.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so where does that leave us? We in CARICOM, we are small. We don't have any military might. We threaten nobody, but we have to be that section of the international community that speaks truth to power, that stands on
And that
principle.
will act just as Belize and the
Yes.
others have. We need to act as well.
Yes, we must always try to be the adult in the room. We must try to be mature, and we must always try to set a positive, and constructive example. So kudos to PM Motley for her statement. Kudos for Belize taking that early, very courageous move, and kudos to St. Vincent and the
Yes,
Grenadines for
quite a
getting on board
Deep
and supporting the
profound
case.
statement
Yes.
in terms of how they want the stop to come about and some of the things they want to see effected. Because I think for us to South Africa having brought the case, they spoke to the fact that both of them are in the apartheid situation.
Yeah. Yes.
The Palestinians,
yes.
just like they were, that's what it is,
So
basically.
South Africa has done the legacy of Nelson Mandela proud, and all of those freedom fighters who would have fought against the apartheid system in South Africa. South Africa is showing that it has not forgotten that struggle, and that I think it became clear to them that what has been inflicted on the Palestinian people
Yes.
is apartheid, and if there's any country that should understand about apartheid
It's
and that
South
should
Africa.
empathize, it is us, you know,
Yes.
and kudos to
and
them.
it's so great that they actually brought the case, you know,
Yes,
because a
yes.
lot of us are talking about it, but everyone wasn't acting. They've acted.
Yes, they've said,
Yes.
let us put the system to the test.
Right.
The ICJ was set up for a certain purpose. Let us utilize the system. And this
Yes.
is the point.
Yes, so
we have to use the system and it
we
has to
are.
work.
And we are. I want to thank you for this morning's conversation. It's been an emotional one, and we're looking forward to see what that ICJ ruling will bring.
Morning, morning,